And look, it's a midlife crisis episode. Hello, and welcome to the 20th installment of Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Today, we're looking at episode 20 of Frasier, entitled Fortysomething. It originally aired on March 31st, 1994, and attracted 27.1 million viewers. Another slight decline week over week, but good enough to be above the season average of 26.3 million viewers. There's no comparison to Seinfeld this week or next week. Seinfeld actually won't be on again until the end of April, on a week Frasier takes off. They won't be on at the same time again until May for the final 3 episodes of the season. 40-something is Duquesne and Moss's last episode, and the first of 2 episodes Rick Barron will direct. This is also the last episode of the season not to be directed by James Burrows. Barron has only been credited as a director on a handful of shows, but he's had a decent career in Hollywood, and a heavy involvement with many Cheers-related episodes. He directed 4 episodes of Wings, 2 of Cheers, and 2 of the 8 episodes of the very short-lived George Wendt Show. As I mentioned before, direction was never his main job. In fact, from 1984 to 2005, he has over 300 credits as a technical coordinator. A technical coordinator is a job which, as the name implies, involves quite a bit of work with the technical aspects of production. The technical coordinator has a hand in both the actual editing process, which includes optimizing trailers and teasers for the network. They also act as a contact for the distribution network heads. Barron had this role for nearly all of Cheers, beginning with season 3. From there, he'd go on to work as a technical coordinator on Wings, Friends, an episode of Becker, the first season of 2.5 Men, and most of the first and second seasons of Frasier. While he was working on 2.5 Men, Barron also worked as the assistant director for the show. An assistant director is not an assistant to the director, but its own job entirely. It relies heavily on logistics and maintaining order on the set. It's a nice step up in responsibilities from that of technical coordinator. Following his work on 2.5 Men, Barron has continued to work as an assistant director to present day. His notable shows in this role are an 88-episode stint on The New Adventures of Old Christine, 37 episodes of Whitney, and 6 episodes of the John Goodman comedy series, The Conners. We have the return of the Lights All Over the City intro this week, tying it up with the elevator and the Space Needle at 5 appearances apiece. There are 6 for the red dot on top of the needle, and 4 for nothing happening intros. Also, of note, this week we have episode code number 121, meaning we are out of production order again. For the second week in a row, we're starting off with the guest caller scene. Here's a little inside baseball. I like to go into these cold without looking at who any of the guest callers or guest stars are going to be beforehand, so I can be surprised as the episode goes on. This week, as soon as the guest caller's voice came on, I was 99% sure who it was. I actually had to pause the episode and look it up just to be sure, or it was going to bother me. This week's guest caller is none other than Reba McEntire. Reba is best known as a country singer. She signed with Mercury Records in 1975 and has had hits since 1976 with the release of her first album. Throughout the rest of the 70s and 80s, Reba continued to grow in success. And in 1986, she won a Grammy, topped the Billboard charts, and went platinum. Tragedy struck in 1991, when nearly half her band members were killed in a plane accident. Dolly Parton and Vince Gill helped her reorganize after the plane crash. Today, she is still recording music and releasing new albums, including a Cracker Barrel exclusive Christmas album. Shortly after she hit it big in music, she also began acting. Her first major role was as Burt Gummer's wife in the 1990 horror comedy classic Tremors. She's continued to act in various spots from then to the present, including recurring roles in more modern shows such as Young Sheldon and Big Sky. She also starred in the eponymous Reba series, which ran from 2001 to 2007 for 125 episodes. Before we move completely out of this scene, we have a nice bit of background imagery here, showing Roz flipping through a magazine while she's letting Frasier take his call. It's a really good background moment. It's not quite on par with how Niles wipes the seat off before he sits down a lot of the times, but it's still a nice moment and one I enjoyed. This brings us right into the meat of the episode, with Frasier failing to remember Roz's name as he's signing off on the radio. He realizes he's getting older and not remembering things as well as he used to. And look, it's a midlife crisis episode. There's nothing wrong with that, but there's only so much you can do with one of those. Our next scene opens with an absolutely insane title card. During our last Moss and Duquesne episode, I commented that their title cards worked, but felt pretty off from what we've seen before. This week, they don't work at all. They pick one small detail out of the scene and make an overly wordy title card out of it. As the scene comes on, we find Martin and Niles playing a game of cards together. Just looking at it, it looked like it could be any number of games where you keep score based on Martin's notepad. But the plastic thing in the middle of the table threw me off and left me wondering what I was looking at. Shout out to KACL780.net, which is a site with transcripts for every episode of the show. According to their transcript for this episode, the card game they're playing is Canasta. I've never personally played Canasta, but from what I understand, it's fairly similar to 500 Rummy. If they are playing Canasta, that means the plastic thing is just a fancy case to hold the cards, and is not an actual part of the game. Considering this is Frasier's apartment, I'm more than willing to believe we're looking at a fancy card case. Frasier and Niles have a brief conversation about when middle age starts, and I hate to break it to Frasier, but in this case, Niles is right. Although there is some variation depending on whom you're talking to, the generally accepted timeline for the start of one's middle age is around 40. I do find it interesting to note that some medical experts argue that middle age goes as late as 65, which means you could easily have a father and son who are both middle-aged at the same time. We learn one additional tidbit from this scene, and it's that Daphne does in fact have friends she goes out to see. We haven't really seen much of this before, but it is a very nice line of dialogue, and along with her very sexual line involving questions she won't answer, we get a look at a less naive and more social Daphne than we've necessarily seen in previous episodes. Martin and Frasier go shopping together at a new location, which has a really nice rack of ties off to the right, to help Frasier weather his midlife crisis, I guess. Honestly, the motivation for Frasier and Martin going on this shopping trip isn't really there. It just sort of happens. And is there to give Martin a few halfway funny lines about the clothing choices of those who are middle-aged. This brings us to our guest star for the episode, Sarah Melson, who is playing the saleswoman and Frasier's pseudo-love interest, Carrie. Melson was only active in the acting community from 1992 until 2000, with the exception of a short film she did in 2017. And she actually kept quite busy during that time. Her first credited role was a one-off appearance in The Wonder Years, before appearing in the 1990s slasher Dr. Giggles. She's appeared in a handful of movies during her time in Hollywood, but she was more prone to television appearances, including spots on Married with Children, Murder, She Wrote, Clueless, and a 4-episode stint on Beverly Hills 90210. After she left the acting world behind, she focused on her music career. She hasn't had any mega hits, but she seems to be doing alright for herself. She's released 4 albums and has had her music featured on Men and Trees, Grey's Anatomy, and The Power of Two. Interestingly, according to IMDb's Known For, on Melson, this role is what most people know her from. We now hit what is possibly the most disappointing moment of the episode. Carrie begins flirting with Frasier and holds up a ridiculously colored striped sweater. Frasier then takes the sweater and some other clothing into what I can only describe as the strangest fitting room I've ever seen. There's saloon-style doors that leave Frasier's feet and upper shoulders exposed. Maybe I'm just not well cultured, but every fitting room I've ever been in is either a curtain or a regular door. They don't leave your feet exposed like a bathroom stall, and they certainly aren't short enough they leave your head exposed. Even looking through online pictures of changing rooms, I can't find any quite like this. I realize it's just a TV set, but it's still a very strange one. Speaking of strange set bits, during the scene in Cafe Nervosa, we only get to see the back half of the cafe. There's actually a pretty interesting reason for this. During every episode where only the back half of the cafe is shown, we have Frasier traveling to somewhere unusual, in this case the department store. Because of the extra set space taken up by the extra set location, the front half of the cafe is not actually available for shooting. As with nearly all of Moss and Duquesne's episodes, Bulldog Briscoe shows up for a scene here. This is Dan Butler's 6th appearance on the show, and despite the statement that he has a different studio in the second episode, it's now beyond clear that he and Frasier do in fact share studio space. While Bulldog unrelentingly hits on young Carrie, we learn a few sad things about Bulldog's love life. It seems Bulldog has engaged the services of women of the night in the past. I don't know that I care for this. In the episode where Frasier accidentally got Bulldog to quit, we learn Bulldog had been in a long-term relationship for years. Yes, he's an obnoxious guy, but he doesn't strike me as the type to pay to spend time with women. This episode also gives us a nice background nugget on Bulldog, and we learn he drives a 1994 Camaro. During the cafe scene, Frasier laments to Niles about his indecision with going out with a girl this young, before ultimately deciding to go after her. And look, this is all very cute and sitcom-y, and at the very end where Frasier pursues her briefly while she rejects him is nice. But I have a big problem with all of this. Namely, Season 11, Episode 12 of Cheers. For those that don't know, in this episode, Frasier had a young secretary. She was 21, who hit on him relentlessly, and he ultimately decided to pursue. It didn't work out because she was just trying to get back with her ex. Obviously, the plotline is a little different here. In the Cheers episode, Sam pushed Frasier to go out with the younger woman. Well, here it is Niles, Roz, and to a lesser extent, Bulldog. Reusing the idea isn't bad, but reusing it only a little over a year after an episode of Cheers with an incredibly similar beat came out is a questionable choice. Before we get to our Kota, I want to talk for just a minute about Niles' game of what meal, song, and wine you'd have if you were trapped on an island. As with most of the things Niles is a fan of, I'm not familiar with any of them, and they're all expensive. Niles' meal is a kubiliak of salmon at Guy's Savoy. Kubiliak of salmon is also known as Salmon Wellington, and is a meal which involves a fillet of salmon stuffed in a bread shell on a bed of rice and other stuffings. It actually looks pretty good. Guy Savoy is a French chef with a high-end restaurant. Briefly perusing his website, it appears meals cost around $700 US. Niles' song, Visse d'Arte, is an opera song from the 1900 show Tosca. It is from the second act of the show. And of course, Niles' wine is an expensive French wine that costs more than most used cars. The Neuf du Pape 47 is a $20,000 bottle of wine today. Considering this episode is nearly 30 years old, based on the value of bottles from the 70s, I would guess that this wine was worth around $5,000 a bottle at the time of this episode's release. We wrap up with a Kota scene showing Daphne again folding laundry. I've mentioned in the past I don't love this as it's really not part of her job, but it is more just a camera shorthand for what her job is. And we see a devious smile creep across her face as she pulls out a pair of colored boxers for Martin. We have a couple blink and you miss them continuity errors this week. First, we have Bulldog's sleeves. Depending on the shot, they're either pushed up or pulled down below his elbow. The other one is Niles' raincoat strap moves around a bit during this scene. Both are minor continuity errors, but interesting tidbits to look at nonetheless. On the ties this week, both of Frasier's are repeats. The first tie was seen just last week, and the second tie, which I still really like, was last seen during episode 12. Niles also wears two ties, and they are also both repeats this week. The first was last seen way back in episode 6, and the second, his purple tie, was last seen in episode 11. So no new ties at all this week, minus the ones in the department store. This is our final Duquesne and Moss episode of the series, and I have to say good riddance, and have fun on the home court. I've tried not to be overly harsh on them, but it's never been a secret that they're my least favorite writers on the show at this point, by a wide margin. The script they turn in here is better than their last one, and even has some nice character moments, including Martin looking at the stretch pants in the department store with excitement, and Niles listing off his choices for being stranded on an island. And I don't know whether to credit the writers or Barron with this, but it's also really nice to see rain going on in the background again this week. The plot for this episode isn't bad as a concept, and I even really like the resolution. I just wish it had been handed off to someone else to write it. If Leslie Eberhard had returned for a third episode, I think this would have been a great topic for him to tackle, along with infidelity and death. For me, a large reason this plot feels so off is because we'd just seen Frasier go out with a younger woman last year on Cheers. He's already had this character beat. Granted, not every Frasier viewer would have seen Cheers, but being the first season, it seems a large percent would have. Barron on direction is also a slightly noticeable change from Burroughs or Ackerman. There's nothing wrong with Barron's direction, and I think he did a fine job. But I did notice an exceptionally large amount of shot reverse shots during conversation scenes, as opposed to the shoulder shots, which have felt much more common in prior Frasier episodes. Overall, this is a really good concept for a Frasier episode, if not the best execution. Sarah Melson is excellent as Frasier's potential love interest. Niles has a couple great moments of being a germaphobe between pushing Eddie off with a handkerchief and wiping the seat off again, and the resolution is really strong. I just wish there was more self-awareness of Frasier's past here. I also wish there weren't a few missed chances for greatness, like getting to see Frasier in the striped sweater. If you want to see Moss and Duquesne's final outing, where they somehow manage to describe Niles as the short blonde man with one wet shoe, settle in for this 6 out of 10 episode of Frasier.